Members, we are on to the next amendment now. Representative Howe, this is the A18-803 amendment. Representative Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. This is a bill we heard earlier in this committee regarding barns that are being used for weddings. In response to the Thumper Pond building collapse in Fergus Falls last year, we passed a bill requiring those types of buildings to get a building permit from Construction Codes and Licensing Division when they're built in areas that have no local building code enforcement. What this amendment does is it requires those buildings that were historically used for farming and now going to be used for weddings or similar events to get a fire marshal inspection. I've worked with the Hospitality Association, the State Fire Marshal's Office, to limit the scope and to try to minimize the impact to I didn't want to include the Chi-Chi's restaurant and that type of thing, so I tried to really narrow the scope and go after the agricultural buildings that are being repurposed. So in that event, what has to happen is it has to have an occupancy over 100 people.
He's got to get out more.
It has to allow alcohol. It's not a lodging house, hospital, hotel, nursing home, school, place of worship, or a Legion or a VFW. So I tried to find a way to narrow this, and the other thing, if you're just going to have one event a year, doesn't apply there also. So it allows that if somebody wants to have one big bash in their barn or in their hog barn or their cow barn, that's an approved event. You don't have to get an inspection by the state fire marshal. So last year, I told the story where I attended a wedding, and it was a brand-new building. I walked in there, and it wasn't what I seen that was the issue. It's what I didn't see that was the problem. The exit doors had no panic hardware. There was no fire alarm system, no smoke detection systems, no fire extinguishers, no exit signs, no emergency lights. When my wife and I went in there, we sat right next to the door because I wanted to make sure we were getting out. Ag buildings, when they're built, they don't require a building permit no matter where they're built. They're not constructed as normal assembly type occupancies are built. They're normally used for storing equipment or animals, not people. So the chance of loss of life is pretty minimal. The structural elements are not engineered. They take into no account for snow load or wind load. The snowstorm last week took down 2 barns that I know of in Wisconsin. If they were full of people, it would have been a big news flash. I think most of us would agree that if a barn is being remodeled and repurposed into a business, people that go there should have a reasonable expectation of a minimum level of life safety. This amendment would bring those buildings, require those buildings to get an inspection by the state fire marshal to maintain or require a minimum level of life safety standard to prevent the loss of life due to fire or collapse in what should be a joyous event. I've worked with the Hospitality Association and the State Fire Marshal to try and narrow this scope as much as possible. I'm still open to, if this amendment goes on, to do a floor amendment or an amendment at the Ways and Means to narrow the scope and bring in to make it more acceptable. But, Mr. Chair, that's the amendment.
Any discussion to the amendment? Representative Munson? Oh, I'm sorry, Baker, then Munson. Okay.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank Representative Howell for bringing this forward. I think it's important that I share my story as a caterer, that we do a lot of off-premise catering, and we do a lot of weddings. And I will tell you, the last 4 or 5 years, we're seeing a lot of explosion with barn activities, and I think it's the coolest thing. What has alarmed me, though, as a caterer, is when I am going into barns or locations that are not fit for this, and then when I hear and see people that thought it was such a great idea and they don't use this barn really for much of anything, they spent a lot of time cleaning it out and getting it ready, they want to put a sign out at the end of the driveway saying, you know, barn for rent. So it covers the multiple use that you're trying to get to, Representative Howe. And for my staff, during that event that was there at the one time we did it, it had to be 100 degrees in that upper level of the loft. It was extremely uncomfortable. My concerns are many that you've already identified. So I think it's identifying the right component is that if all of a sudden it looks like a business venture and it wasn't built for that, it has to be looked at a little differently when they put a sign at the end of the driveway saying barn for rent. It isn't just for your daughter that wanted to always have her wedding at this barn because that's the family home site. This is a little different, and I appreciate your work on this, and I will support this. Thank you.
Representative Munson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to talk about some of the concerns that I have about this amendment. Last year, we fixed up a barn for a wedding reception, and it cleaned it out and had a great event there. Certainly was not up to state code because state code doesn't apply to farms in our district. There's a long list of items that would have to be fixed to bring it up to state code if we were to rent out the barn for that purpose. But this, I guess if a barn was to be used for this on a farm site, that owner of that barn is going to be liable for any injury that would occur. And so they're going to reach out. If this is going to be a legitimate business, they're going to have to call an insurance agent and get an insurance policy that would cover that specific use. I've talked to insurance agents in my district, and most of the insurance agents would come out and inspect that property for use for its purpose. And if it doesn't have fire alarms, then they wouldn't offer the policy. The insurance industry is going to protect their liability, and they will come up with a list of requirements to make that barn compliant. Farmers nowadays they don't want to have this extra liability that they could lose their farm if there's a trip and fall that happens on the farm during an event. So I don't support this because the implementing statewide building codes to every township in the state would bring a large burden on people, on their businesses. And this amendment was written for a specific purpose for barns. If people built a barn to code and invested all of the money they needed to invest to bring it up to code, I can see how their business plan now would require that they have to charge a lot of money for this event in order to make it worthwhile. And if they're upset that other people are renting out barns for a fraction of the cost, this bill would look to protect their business and their interests. But it's to spend $500,000 fixing up a barn to bring it up to everything, all the statewide building codes would be really expensive, and it would prevent people from getting into this business. I'd like to ask Representative Howe a few questions about the bill to understand its intent. And I would like to start on line 1.17 of the amendment, where it says the place of accommodation means publicly or privately owned building historically used for farming. Who determines, and what's the purpose of this? Is it just you're looking at if it's a barn, if it was always used historically for farming, or what if it was never used for farming? Whose burden is that? Is it the owner, or is it the state inspector to make the decision on whether that building had been used for agricultural, used for farming?
Representative Howe. And Representative Howe, it's up to you if you want to take questions now or if you want to wrap these up in a summation statement. That's your decision.
I'm not afraid of a few questions, but, I think you can take a look at a building and you know whether it's an ag building, built as an ag building, agricultural building or not. There's a pretty distinct line on whether the building was built to a building code, because I will say that this amendment does not enforce the state building code statewide. What this does is it applies the state fire code statewide. And when the state fire code goes out, there's an existing building section. So it does not bring them up to new code. What this does is brings them up to a minimum level of life safety. So just to give you a little bit of information on how that works, is the state fire code and the state building code work differently, so.
And so,
Representative Munson.
thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to clarify in the fire code, it's not just about putting a smoke detector and a fire extinguisher. This is about emergency lighting and commercial doors that would open out and that such. Is that correct?
Representative Howe.
Definitely, means of egress, emergency lighting, depending upon the occupant load would all, and this, if they're over 100, it would drive all those emergency lighting, exit signs. I don't know about a fire alarm system. I'd have to have a plan and look up exactly what all would be required as far as a fire alarm system, but it would at least drive in the minimum things that would get people out in an emergency.
Representative Munson.
And would that also apply to having buildings sprinkled, installing sprinklers?
Representative Howe.
Not an architect. I am a building official. I'd have to open up it depends on the plan. I'd have to take a plan and look at it. But depending upon it, it could require that. As it's an existing building, it just kind of depends on what all is in there and how that's all done. But it may require sprinklers, but not all of them would have to be sprinkled. There's different levels that would drive that issue.
Representative Munson.
And I noticed that schools are called out in line 121, but it sounds like that's only if it's being used as a school. If somebody, in my district, there's several small towns that had old schools that people had purchased for renovating into different purposes, and these towns are small enough that they have not implemented statewide building codes. If someone were to hold an event in an old school, would it also require that they bring that up to state fire code as well?
Representative Howe.
Well, Representative Munson, I know that certain people call kids animals, but I don't believe they actually qualify as a per unit in the ag business, so no, they'd be up.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Munson.
And to that point, on line 1.91, or 1.19, it says that if these buildings would have to be designed for occupancy by 100 or more people, if it was designed as a barn, it would be designed for holding livestock and not people. So wouldn't barns be exempt under this?
Mr. Howe. Representative Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, in that respect, when you, in this terminology, when you design your new occupancy from a barn to a place of a public accommodation, that's when you're saying it's designed for an occupant load of more than 100. So if half of the building is kitchen and half of it is storage and the occupant load is less than 100, that's where the design comes in. So
Okay.
that's the difference in that terminology.
And it's a follow-up question to when you mentioned storage. On line 1.18, it says that the building has to be principally used for wedding receptions or similar social events. If my barn, if I was to use my barn to store RVs for 7 months out of the year, or in this case, 9 months out of the year, since our winter's going so long, wouldn't then the principal use of my barn be for storing RVs if I'm storing it for 9 months out of the year and I hold weddings for 3 months out of the year?
Representative Howe.
I would say your principal use is multi-use. That's where I would deem that if you're going to use it for both purposes, I'd probably claim it's probably a multi-use facility. So that would be one of those, that'd be a good question. But it depends on how you design it. And if you're going to design the building to do both, then I would say its principal use is multi-use, and it would probably fall under this. So it's, but that's a good question.
Representative Munson.
I'm obviously, I have reservations about this, and I'm going to be voting no, but I think that it's a slippery slope to start with just this very narrow place. We have a lot of, wineries and breweries in our district and on-farm wineries that have using their facility in a barn, and they may host an event, and whether it is a wedding or what's noted here as similar receptions, I think that this statewide code is going to be applied to more and more businesses. And when one of my counties, Blue Earth County, that I represent, looked at implementing statewide building code, they received a lot of backlash from businesses that were not, ADA compliant, a seed salesman out in the country. Now, I mean, there's a lot of building codes that don't apply to people that live in the country or in towns smaller than 2,500 people. And this, to me, is an expansion of, government that I cannot support. So I'm going to be voting no on the bill. Thank you for answering the questions.
Representative Newberger, then Mahoney. Representative Newberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Representative Howell, for bringing this forward. I do support this. One of the principal aims of government is to protect its people. And I like the way that this bill targets people that are simply trying to use this as a business, not as the private use, as you had talked about, that those folks would be exempt. Now, I have 19 townships. I have a district that's full of barns. And if anyone's ever seen a barn fire, people know that once a barn starts to burn, it goes hot, it goes fast, and it's usually over before you know it. If this was a barn, this room right here, I did a quick count, we got about 80 people. We got 4 exits. If we locked 3 of them, and this was a barn, and this thing started on fire, and half the people in this room had been enjoying themselves with cocktails, how many would make it out that door if this thing started on fire? I hate the guess. So my point being, Representative Howe, is thank you for bringing this forward, because God forbid somebody starts renting their barn out this summer and there's a fire and people that are just having a good time end up being killed. The outcry is going to be, what the hell? You guys heard this. You guys heard this bill. You had a chance to do something about it, and you chose not to. So I will be voting yes. Does it need some work? Yeah, it does. But I'm glad we're moving forward on it. Thank you.
Representative Mahoney.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I too will be voting yes on this. This is a relatively narrowly crafted bill. And I too, was it last summer, was in a barn, and I kind of chuckled when the author of the amendment talked about sitting next to the door. I too sat next to the door for that particular reason. This is designed, this narrowly crafted amendment is a good idea. If you're going to have a business of renting out an accommodation space for 100 people or more, you're making a living at it, and you should be subject to the fair requirements that every other business is set to. So I think this is a good amendment, and I hope it goes on.
Representative Fabian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, real quickly, I don't support the amendment. I think that there is some work to do. I appreciate what Representative Howe is trying to do, and probably would encourage withdrawing the amendment just to keep on working on some of the issues. Thank you.
Representative Munson.
Just a couple of follow-up questions to what Representative Mahoney said, that this would only apply to what other businesses are faced with complying with, and that's not true. This doesn't apply to the other businesses in the district. It's just this one specific type of business if the rest of the county doesn't enforce these rules. But I also had a follow-up question on line 120 where it says serves alcohol. I'm assuming that these 4 items have to all, this barn would have to be principally used for wedding, designed to occupy 100 or more people, serve alcohol, and is not one of these places that are called out. Is that correct, that it has to have all 4 together?
Representative Howe.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair and Representative Munson. Actually, it has to hit the other 3. If it's number 4, it's not, doesn't apply to them. So it's actually, it has to do all 3 of those. So if they don't serve alcohol, they don't have to get a state fire marshal inspection. So in that respect, I figured if they have all their faculties, they got a good shot at getting out of there. But if they're had a few cocktails, they probably aren't quite aware of what's all going on. So that's why they can actually have their facility, do wedding dances and whatever else they want to do, but as long as they don't allow the alcohol to be on there, they'd probably not get a state fire marshal inspection.
Okay. Well,
Representative Munson.
I'm sad to see that there's discrimination against Mormons having celebrations, but I just also wanted to make sure that, but by this understanding, then BYOB and self-serve alcohol would still be allowed. It's not that they have to actually serve alcohol.
Representative Howell.
No, actually, it's actually, you know, and if that's what needs to be done, we may change that to allows alcohol. So that's probably one of those changes that I'll probably need to make, so.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yep. Representative New.
I apologize. I had to step out for another committee. Just a quick question, hopefully. Representative Howe, do you know, I mean, as a building inspector, are there other businesses that are currently not subject to building inspections? Or is this barn situation sort of unique in that it was built for another purpose and therefore exempted and is sort of being grandfathered into this exemption currently?
Representative Howell.
Well, if it's actually, the building code is required to be enforced in any community over 2,500, a population of over 2,500. If you're outstate, let's say if you're building a house, if you're a residential building contractor, you're supposed to build it to the residential building code. The problem is with the lack of inspections and enforcement out in those rural areas, the chances are it's probably not. But this does not go to enforce building codes. You'll see that if you go out, there's a statute that requires hotels, motels to be inspected every 3 years by the state fire marshal. They can be constructed without a building code, but the state fire marshal comes in and requires minimum life safety. They go up to resorts, they do a lot of different places get a state fire marshal inspection. Doesn't mean that they were built to the building code. So this just, you know, as we've seen the wedding barn thing pop up, it looks like this is something that we're going to have a lot of people in a building that wasn't designed for this, and that's why we've targeted the wedding barn situation right now. I mean, it's, when you heard the testimony from the folks that have gone out and looked at these things, they actually, some of them prohibit certain songs from being played by the musicians or the DJs, because when people start to dance on the floor, it actually moves the floor enough that they have issues and concerns with the structural integrity. So that's why we need to go out and take a look at it.
Representative New.
Thank you. I appreciate that clarification. I'll be honest, I'm torn on this bill because I see the safety concerns for sure. I'm also a little concerned that perhaps we are regulating them then in a way that other facilities will not be regulated. So I'm torn, to be honest.
Representative Anderson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Quickly, I had some concerns also, but again, it's a safety issue, and I like the addition that if I want to have a barn dance once a year, that there's the exception for that. So I too support the bill.
Any additional discussion? Seeing none, Representative Howell renews his motion to have House on the amendment to pass. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say nay.
No.
The motion does not prevail.